So, if you are ready, I am not Moses, my beard is much smaller than Moses, but here are 10 conservative commandments that I hope will be of interest to you. The first commandment is, thou shalt not look at the past with rose-tinted spectacles. Now, it is very good, I think, that Jerry is here rather than John O'Sullivan, because the last time I made this point, John O'Sullivan said, absolutely not. Conservatism is about pessimism rather than optimism. It's about seeing the problems that exist and rejecting the perfection of human nature. Well, that is part of conservatism, but I would say it's not the full part. Perhaps it does not need to be said in this country that has been at the centre of so many of this continent's wars and had to live under the control of the Soviet Union. Perhaps there is optimism in this country about the future relative to the past. But there is pessimism from too many conservatives. And that is understandable in many ways. Our world faces very serious challenges. Terror, ISIS, the refugee crisis that of course is very live at the moment, family breakdown. But humankind, I believe, has solved bigger problems in the past, and without being naive, I think we can triumph in the future again. I think it's particularly important that conservatives be optimistic about the future, because our core beliefs, including free enterprise, including private ownership, including the power of the family, these are the things that underpin what I think is the greatest time to be alive in human history. Now, I don't know, I'm going to ask various questions at various points in my speech, but they will be rhetorical. I won't expect there to be a show of hands in the audience. But I ask you honestly to answer the question, what time would you rather be alive than now? And I think if you look at the medical advances that we have, the access to technology, the general reduction in inequality, the statistic that Jerry just quoted, the fact that 125,000 people every single day of the last 20 years have been lifted out of absolute poverty. I don't know about you, but some of the worst people to be around are the people who are always complaining about their health, always complaining about the weather. We're particularly good at that in Britain, complaining about the weather, always moaning about something. The greatest people to be around are the people who have a can-do spirit. Thanks to pointed out to me the Ronald Reagan statue that stands in between your parliament and the American embassy today. Ronald Reagan, one of the reasons he was such a success was he believed that tomorrow would be better than today, and the day after that would be better. In Britain, Boris Johnson is the most popular politician in the country. The Mayor of London, you may know him with the big blonde hair and larger-than-life personality. Yes, we have to be realistic, as John O'Sullivan would remind us, but my first commandment for conservatism is be optimists. Be hopeful about the world that we have created, because conservatism has largely created this world. Don't go around as pessimists. The second commandment that I would offer is an accompaniment really to the first, and that is all friends of free enterprise must be more intolerant of its failures than any enemy of free enterprise. So, I have just said how important I think free enterprise has been to the creation of the world that we live in, the advances in medicine, the advances in prosperity that most people enjoy today. But in 2 weeks' time, I will be publishing a report that I've been working on for the last 6 months on the future of capitalism. And we've conducted a survey in 7 countries, Britain, America, Germany, Brazil, India, Thailand, Indonesia. And the findings are quite extraordinary. In every single country, people believe in capitalist societies, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. 70 to 80% of people believe that big businesses only became big because they have paid corrupt money to the government, that they have broken health and safety rules, that they have somehow acted in underhand ways. Capitalism has a terrible public relations problem. 2/3 of people in America believe that hunger around the world is getting worse. The reality is that hunger is collapsing around the world. Capitalist industry spends $600 billion every year on advertising, but it cannot sell itself. So let me be clear. I believe that I'm a friend of capitalism. I believe that conservatives should be friends of capitalism. But we need to be aware that it has this fundamental public relations problem. And my friends, there are good reasons for that. The crash of 2008, the libel fixing scandal that has stained the reputation of the City of London back in my home country. Very, very recently, of course, we've had the Volkswagen scandal with the engine fixing. We shouldn't, as friends of free enterprise, sweep these problems under the carpet. We need to be angrier and more resolved to put them right than anybody else. I read, thanks to Jerry, a speech that Mr. Orban gave last year to the Balvanios Free University. I hope my pronunciation is half acceptable. And he listed in that speech a great many of the problems of free enterprise. And then I was reading them, I was ticking them one after another and agreeing with them. But the answer is not for the state to take over these businesses. It is not for the taxpayer to become even more involved and more regulation. The response is for absolute punishment of fraud. Far too few people go to jail who have misbehaved in the banking system. We need to enforce competition so that monopolies cannot get control of markets, and we need to keep cronyism under control. The reason why I worry slightly about some of what Mr. Orban was saying in his speech was when politicians and business get too close, it is nearly always the consumers and the taxpayers that lose out in the long run. So yes, the second commandment is we, as those who support free enterprise, must be least tolerant of its failures. But we must make free enterprise more free, not less free, not introduce and politicize it and turn it into something that bureaucrats control. My third commandment, and this sounds a little bit more like a commandment from the Bible, is the state cannot love your neighbor as well as you can. Now, I must stop mentioning, getting lots of references, but I had a wonderful tour of Parliament this afternoon, and I saw a copy of your constitution, your country's constitution, and I was very pleased as a Christian to see that the first word in your constitution is God. God bless the Hungarian people, I think, is the beginning. So my question, rhetorical question to you in this commandment is, who do you see God as? When you think of God, what do you think of? Do you see God as some kind of Father Christmas? Do you have Father Christmas, Santa Claus? I don't know what the expression is in Hungary for St. Nicholas. There's different cultures have different expressions. But do you see God as someone who dispenses gifts at Christmas time, comes down the chimney and gives people presents, whether they are good or bad? Or do you see God more of as a loving father, someone who actually judges his children's behavior, who doesn't want them to be infants forever, but wants them to become adults? I think we build the kind of welfare model that we have in society in the image of the God that we worship. If we see God as a Santa Claus type figure, we build a welfare state that does not ask anything of people. We build a welfare state that does not demand change from people. We give out goodies to people regardless of their behavior. If, however, our theology, and I owe this insight to an American writer called Marvin Olasky. If, however, we see God as more of a father figure who wants his children to grow up into mature adults, we won't be happy that people stay on the welfare state, that they regard on benefits. We will do everything to bring out that creator in them. I believe that all men and women are made in the image of God. And as God is a creator, are we releasing the creator in people by the society that we build, or are we keeping them as dependent people? Do we, in other words, have a feed and forget or stingy form of compassion, or do we as a society have a liberating form of compassion? A stingy compassion is one where we don't love our neighbours ourselves, we pay for other people to do it. It's one where we don't give our children the time that they need to flourish. Instead, we shower them with toys and use TV and game stations as babysitters. It's where we run schools that give children soft grades rather than the skills that will prepare them for success in life. A feed and forget welfare state is in one which we give the unemployed enough money to eat and be housed, but we don't give them enough care and attention and self-belief so that they can stand on their own 2 feet. For me, this is one of the crucial differences between conservatism and socialism. Socialism largely sees that you fight poverty by an ever bigger state, an ever bigger benefits bill. I believe that the 3 agents of change in society that advance social justice are parents, teachers, and job creators. Those, more than the state, are the people that make a difference and build the good society. And one of the differences, I would say, between conservatism and libertarianism, the difference between conservatism and socialism is the difference between what we value as the agent of change. The difference, I think, between conservatism and libertarianism is conservatives don't just say you're on your own. Don't just say to parents, teachers, and job creators, it's your job. Where we can help each of those agents of change, conservatives will, whether that's in the tax system, investment in education, or whether it's the kind of business environment that most produces wealth, which I would say includes things like government interventions in infrastructure. So that, for me, is the 3rd commandment. 4th commandment, thou shalt not scorn the state. An idea developed in some circles, especially during the 1980s, that conservatism was all about freedom. It was understandable because the battles during that decade were against communism. They were against anti-democratic and very powerful trade unions and some very poorly performing nationalised industries. But conservatives aren't just about taking down the power of the state, reducing the state, controlling the state. Conservatives believe in providing law, order, defence, but more than that too, and something I will come on to is a safety net for people. People crave security as well as freedom. And conservatives that only emphasise freedom, political parties that only emphasise freedom, not only, I think, do not deserve to do well, but do not do well. Another rhetorical question for you. Tell me the most successful libertarian government in the world today. There aren't, perhaps any. Rand Paul, the latest great hero of the libertarian movement in the United States, he was supposed to be the one to propel American libertarianism forward. He's currently getting about 2% in opinion polls, and I wouldn't be surprised any day now his candidacy will draw to an end. If people have to choose between a libertarian and a socialist party, they will choose a socialist party. People do not want to be left alone. The strong, the rich, the very powerful may support libertarianism and want to be left alone, but it is not the mindset of the average person. Conservatives are small government philosophers, not no government or anti-government philosophers. And one of the things we most need to get right. My next commandment, though, is to say that neither should we close our ears to libertarianism. If adopting anti-government language that frightens voters is one danger, there's another danger. Some would argue a bigger danger, and that's the risk that conservatives get too comfortable with running the large state. And I've already referred a little bit to that in the context of Prime Minister Orban's lecture last year. It's easy to give in to the vested interest groups and lobbyists who will always want more taxpayers' money for their pet causes. They find that the big government conservatives find it easier to increase borrowing that falls on tomorrow's taxpayers than decrease spending, which is felt and protested against immediately. Conservatives, therefore, should always be looking for opportunities to keep the state under control, and we're why, despite my disagreements with many libertarians, I do actually believe that they are an essential part of the Conservative coalition. That concern about government, that scepticism about government, is important to be part of the tradition to keep the movement sound. Libertarians are, after all, fundamentally right that government rarely does things better than private and voluntary groups. Much state spending doesn't go to the most deserving or vulnerable. Let us never forget that most taxpayers are in a daily struggle to afford things that they want to afford but can't, and every extra tax on them denies them what they would ideally provide for themselves and their families. Government isn't good at knowing what people really want, and there is something totalitarian about a society where more and more people get more out of the system than they put in, which is certainly true of most now advanced Western nations. More and more government spending ultimately leads to more borrowing, and no indebted nation is ever really in true control of its destiny. Economic textbooks are, it appears, full of examples of market failure. How many times do you read about when markets go wrong? I began my lecture by talking about the failures of capitalism. A recent study of textbooks in America, Land of the Free, we are told, actually found that in 23 of the most common textbooks used in America, they were 6 times as likely to cover market failure as government failure. But actually government failure when it comes to corruption or cronyism or putting money into failed projects is just as much of a problem. My next commandment is that we should provide an ambulance as well as a ladder. Conservatives love stories of aspiration. We love stories about people born on the wrong side of the tracks who make it big, who crash through glass ceilings. We love stories of the people who succeed, particularly when they have started from the bottom. But most people are not ever going to ride a magnificent ride from bottom to top. Lots of people are satisfiers, not maximizers. They don't want great riches, they don't want great success, they want security rather than freedom, back to that earlier point I made, and they don't want to be left alone in tough times. A conservatism that only speaks about ambition and success doesn't speak to them. Personally, I cannot quote Winston Churchill enough, so let me quote him for you now. "We Tories," he said, "are for the ladder. Let all try their best to climb. They, Labour, the Socialists, are for the queue. Socialists say let each wait in his place until his turn comes. But we ask, what happens if anyone slips out of his place in the queue? Ah, say the Socialists, our officials, and we have plenty of them, come and put him back in his place, or perhaps put him lower down to teach the others a lesson. And when they come back to us and say, we have told you what happens if anyone slips off the ladder, out of the queue, what is your answer to what happens if anyone slips off the ladder? Churchill said, I don't know whether I can do a Churchill impersonation. Our reply is we will have a good net and the finest social ambulance service in the world. That is what we as conservatives must offer. Yes, we must offer the ladder. We must help people to climb, but actually providing a safety net, the finest social ambulance service in the world. It shouldn't be an afterthought for conservatives to ensure that there is a pension and a decent welfare safety net for everyone. We should be proud to ensure that every person in society has a minimum income. Every conservative, Thatcher, Reagan, Angela Merkel, provides a safety net. But often we don't look as though we value it. And that is something we need to change. My next commandment. There is a saying in England, I don't know whether you have it over here as well, if you want something done, ask a woman. A few women are nodding at this point, I can see in the audience. Another one is, if you want something done, ask a busy person, rather than someone with nothing to do. Well, I'm going to adapt that saying for the purpose of this lecture and say, if you want something done, ask a nation state, not a supranational institution. Yesterday I gave a talk to the Danube Institute on why I would support Britain leaving the European Union. I won't repeat all that I've said now, but I'm happy to in questions afterwards if it would be useful. But I do think if you look at when problems need to be solved, if you wait for organisations like the European Union or the United Nations to do it, you can wait a very, very long time indeed. Talk to the people of Rwanda, Darfur, Srebrenica, Syria in our time, who have been waiting for the United Nations to do something for the problems that they have faced. Look at the people of Greece waiting for the European Union to solve the Eurozone crisis. The young unemployed across the southern periphery of Europe still suffering from the Eurozone. This country today wrestling with the crisis on its borders. What is the European Union doing to solve these problems? My personal belief, and very strong belief, is that effective nation states are the underpinning of a safe and secure global order. They are democracies that are willing to move swiftly when problems occur, not bureaucracies that move only as quickly as the slowest member of the convoy. I read the remarks by Prime Minister Orban complaining about the European Union. I think his description that he wanted an illiberal democracy rather than a liberal democracy was perhaps badly put. But I think the basic point, which John O'Sullivan said actually what probably meant was a problem of undemocratic liberalism, is true. When power is too far away from the people, institutions decay. And most supranational institutions are too far away from the people. I lived in Germany for a number of years, and I saw the enormous sacrifice that the people of West Germany were willing to make for the people of East Germany when the wall came down. I see today that sacrifice is not being willing to made by the people of Germany or other countries in Europe. I'm not singling Germany out, for the people of Greece. And it is not evident in the attitude of people of Europe to Syria either. The nation state is nearly always the right vehicle to solve social problems. The next commandment, and this is an echo of something Jerry said at the beginning about conservatives liking hunting, fishing, and shooting rather than philosophy. The most important thing for conservatives is that they recognise is that politics is not the most important thing in life. A very good book that I recently read by David Brooks, the New York Times columnist that some of you may read. It's called The Road to Character. And in that book, he said, you can live life according to two sets of values. You can live to fill your CV, your curriculum vitae, your resume, or alternatively, you can live your life for what people will say about you at your funeral, in your eulogy. I thought it was a very profound question. How do we, all in this room, live our lives? Are we looking always for the thing that will look good on a CV that we present in a job application? Or actually, are we looking for what people would say at our funeral about our commitment to our community, our commitment to our family, and our commitment to our nation? I began by talking about the importance of free enterprise. The economy is incredibly important, but for conservatives it cannot be the most important thing. Conservatives cannot just be resume, CV parties. Conservative parties have to also be eulogy parties. They have to have that sense of what is the most important thing in life. Politics is downstream from religion, from education, from art and culture. Societies are formed in those spheres, and that is where I don't think always enough conservatives are engaged with. If we allow liberals and socialists to take over our churches, our universities, our art institutions, our television studios, our theatres, it won't be long before all of the key battles in life are being lost. My penultimate commandment: never rest on your achievements, because there are no final victories in politics. Perhaps Hungarians in 1989 thought the communists were finally defeated and were gone. But of course what happened was that many of the ex-communists found their way into all sorts of privatized companies that weren't really privatized and took over levers of control of power throughout society. We thought in Britain that the anti-capitalists had been defeated. We thought those that wanted to give up our national defences were defeated by the battles that Margaret Thatcher fought in the 1980s. But for those of you who follow British politics, we have just had Jeremy Corbyn, elected leader of the Labour Party, someone who has appointed as his finance spokesman, someone who says his hobby is the overthrow of capitalism. He wants to give up Britain's nuclear weapons and does not believe in a proper defence budget. Battles that we thought had won are now back at the centre stage of British politics. Anti-Semitism makes continual comebacks. Whatever memorials, centres, museums, institutions, films are produced, there are certain ideas that will not die. Conservatism has a developed idea of sin. We don't believe in utopias. We do recognise that nearly every institution has within it the seeds of its own destruction and decline. We believe that law and institutions protect society from both excesses of liberty and of control. We do not believe in concentrated power. We do not believe that there are final victories. So my final commandment is, again, inspired by Winston Churchill. And it's slightly related to the last one, but I think different. The last one, that there are no final victories in politics. The 10th and my final commandment is never rest on your achievements. Never go into an election believing that voters will thank you for what you have done. They never are grateful for what you have done, or rarely grateful. They're always saying, okay, you've done that, what is next? Stephen Harper has just found that out in Canada. He presided over a very successful economy, and he's just been booted out because, frankly, he wasn't exhibiting a vision that captured the Canadian people's imagination. Perhaps the greatest ever example of this was Winston Churchill. Poland surrendered 26 days after the Nazi invaders had crossed its borders. The Netherlands surrendered to Hitler within 4 days of being attacked. Within just 1 week, it was under complete German control. Belgium fell in 18 days. France, then Britain's key ally, was lost in a mere 6 weeks. The Nazi war machine was moving through Europe like a hot knife through butter. The invasion of Britain was next, and it must have been terrifying. One man, however, was as strong and determined as the circumstances demanded. As Britons gathered around their radios, their new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, urged them to fight. Churchill told his fellow countrymen that the very survival of Christian civilization and the long continuity of our institutions was at stake. The whole fury and might of the enemy will soon be turned on us, he said. Hitler knows that he will have to break Britain and this island, or he will lose the war. If Britain failed to resist Hitler, Churchill feared a new dark age, made more sinister and more protracted by the lights of perverted science. But if Britain could prevail, it would be our finest hour. Churchill, of course, helped win that war. When Britain stood alone for a year, he triumphed. He held the nation together. Can you think of a prime minister or a leader of a country who more deserved to win the 1945 general election in Britain than Winston Churchill? No one delivered more for their nation than he did. The 1945 general election, he was defeated in one of the worst landslides that ever occurred in British political history. Labour won. They had been his coalition partners. They weren't uninvolved in the war effort. But nonetheless, the hero of the war, the man who galvanised Britain in that fight, was defeated. So whatever Prime Minister Orban does, whatever Prime Minister David Cameron does, whatever Angela Merkel has done, the next election is always about what you're going to do for people next. That is the conservative final commandment I would like to leave with you. Conservatism can never rest on its laurels. Conservatives can never rest on their laurels. It's always, what can we offer the people next to tackle the real problems that they face that we should be focused on. That's the end of my commandments. That is my end of my talk. As I think you might say, here endeth the lesson. Thank you very much for listening to me this evening.